If you're feeling spooky, then we've got the pins for you. Osiris and Anubis are available in our merch shop for a limited time, link below.
What's that exotic smell in the air? That intoxicating blend of spices that conjures up visions of distant wonders and treasures untold? That's right, it's pumpkin spice season, and it's high time we use this glorious Halloween special to unpack the last of the great classic keystones of horror. And unpack might be slightly on the nose phrasing, because today's very special guest star comes to us straight from the deepest, driest tombs. We've talked about Dracula, Frankenstein, werewolves in the broad and specific, and now it's time we round out the cast with some royalty. Today, we're gonna talk about mummies. And joining me on this nuanced and multifaceted topic with a trail of historical context 5,000 years long, here to share the stage with me is the cerulean storyteller himself, your co-host and mine, Blue!
I know we both have a reputation for idiosyncratic speech patterns, but why on earth are you talking like that?
I've been reading a lot of 1800 spec fic for this, and I have learned to never use one word when 15 will do.
You know, that tracks.
So, let's start with the easy parts. The concept of a mummy as a monster is, in its current form, pretty easy to explain. Long ago in ancient Egypt, someone got mummified, which was happening a lot back then. And now, in the exotic surroundings of current time and place, the mummy is reawakened. After this point, interpretations vary somewhat. The classic image of a horror movie mummy is a shambling, zombie-like undead, swathed in bandages, but otherwise not particularly distinct from any garden variety walking corpse, minus the contagion element that's a staple of modern zombie media. These zombie-type mummies basically look the same in and out of the sarcophagus. However, mummies contain multitudes, and some mummies shed the wrappings and rehydrate into revitalized images of the shape and power they once held in life. Where mummies still in their original packaging are generally portrayed as near-mindless, basically zombies, mummies that moisturize are much more powerful and intelligent, and typically supplement their undead sturdiness with a broad swath of sorcerous powers. But the fascinating thing about mummies in media is that the tropes about them were developing in parallel to the actual discovery and decipherment of ancient Egyptian writings about it. There was a starting foundation of basic knowledge that was broadly accessible to Western audiences courtesy of ancient Greeks like Herodotus, a historiographer who wrote up some detailed and genuinely pretty accurate rundowns of the mummification practiced in the neighboring land of Egypt, and the various big-name gods they favored. But he pointedly skirted around the issue of why everyone was getting mummified. What did they hope to achieve with this careful preservation of their dead? Before hieroglyphs were deciphered, nobody in the western neck of the woods really knew, and as a result, those early mummy stories are pretty lacking in actual ancient Egyptian concepts of the soul, the afterlife, and the spells required to safely transfer one into the other. All these writers knew was that Egypt was full of intricately preserved dead people laid to rest in massive, near-impenetrable edifices, and that's the kind of concept that sets the creative gears spinning.
So to understand the development of the mummy in fiction, let's wind our way back to the start and trace the tale of the phenomenon we can call Egyptomania. Herodotus' early travelogues are all well and good, but the first OSP-certified Egyptomaniac was Rome. In the 1st century BC, the Romans saw Egypt as the last missing piece of their pan-Mediterranean empire. As the biggest breadbasket in the Eastern Med and a legendary source of wealth, it was an indispensable part of the Roman world, but it also made for a pretty slick trophy Rome could brag about. In the century after its conquest, Rome expended considerable effort to import Egyptian obelisks as spiffy new monuments, and one hotshot Roman built himself an entire pyramid in the city. The agenda of all that Egyptian iconography was hardly hidden. Egypt is a part of Rome. This is ours now, but it's telling that Egypt got more fanfare than other newly conquered territories. And on the flip side, the loss of Egypt to the Muslim Caliphate in the 600s stung far worse than when Italy went splitsies in 476. During the Renaissance 1,000 years later, renewed interest in the classical world in general and the glories of Rome specifically meant a small but notable curiosity in Egypt. In the 1600s, Roman architects rekindled their zest for obelisks and pyramids, and German scholar Athanasius Kircher took a crack at translating hieroglyphics. His efforts didn't go anywhere, but they set off a broader push to understand this exotic and mystical world on a deeper level than raw aesthetics. But the more they learned, the more questions they had, and that only added to the mystique. As academic interest grew, Egypt and its iconography took on different meanings for different groups. In the 1700s, the Freemasons co-opted Egyptian symbols as a source of wisdom, hence motifs like the very non-American pyramid on the $1 bill. This was one way to signify being a worldly free thinker, willing to step beyond the comfy Western norms. And by the very end of the century, Egypt gained a pointed political significance in revolutionary France. As Foreign Minister Talleyrand said, Egypt was a province of the Roman Republic, she must become a province of the French Republic. The logic there is more than a little flimsy, but the message was clear enough. 2 months later, in April 1798, 1898, France formed an Army of the Orient under General Napoleon to go grab it. General Nappity Bappity had a grand old time conquering Egypt, but unbeknownst to him, this little jaunt would completely transform Egypt's place in world culture. During some fort renovation near the port city of Rosetta, the French army discovered a giant slab of rock with inscriptions in 3 languages: hieroglyphs, Egyptian Demotic, and Greek. The stone dated back to the Ptolemaic period when society was multilingual in Greek and Egyptian, so the hope was that each inscription was actually the same text in different languages. That meant a translation of the Greek would reveal exactly what this wall of hieroglyphs said, and from there they just have to break it down to understand the component pieces in Demotic and hieroglyphic. This was a gateway to finally understanding what the hell all those hieroglyphs were saying. The Rosetta Stone's decipherment was a very alluring goal, and it soon became a microcosm of Egyptomania as a whole because the Rosetta Stone itself wound up in London. The British muscled France out of Egypt in 1801, and before the Ottomans in turn muscled Britain out in 1803, the Brits shipped a bundle of treasure off to London, including the stone. They plonked it in the British Museum and made prints of the text to distribute to scholars, which facilitated the collective translation effort. But Egypt had more to offer than just linguistic enlightenment, and the prospect of eminently stealable, shiny artifacts was too alluring to ignore. So in the ensuing century, interest in Egypt would become far bigger and far more lucrative than mere academic linguistics. Still, the decipherment of hieroglyphs was a high priority, and it got its share of time and focus. It was hardly a casual process, but over the next 20 years, an international assortment of scholars tried their hands at deciphering it. One critical discovery in the process was the confirmation that a cartouche signified royal names like Ptolemaios and Cleopatra, which allowed Jean-François Champollion to assemble an alphabet of phonetic hieroglyphs, and in 1822, the code was cracked. There was still plenty left to decipher from the massive trove of documents and inscriptions spread across Egypt, and they still hadn't figured out by literal signs or phonetic complements or determinatives yet, but this was the turning point where scholars actually had a shot at understanding what they were reading. And beyond the realm of hieroglyphics, archaeology was making some important leaps forward. In the decade after the Rosetta Stone, Britain employed the unmatchably stylish Giovanni Belzoni to excavate sites across Egypt and export whatever could fit on a boat over to England. His team uncovered the temples of Abu Simbel and the tomb of Seti I in the Valley of the Kings in 1817, leading to numerous detailed schematics and drawings for publication and an entire exhibition recreating Seti's tomb in the recently constructed Egyptian Hall in London. In 1815, his team successfully acquired a bust of Ramses II, which inspired Percy Shelley to write the poem Ozymandias, what with the lone and level sands stretching far away, and such. Then in 1821, he performed the first public mummy unwrapping in London, but hold on to that thought because we'll pick it back up later. Not to be left completely in the dust, France in 1821 acquired the Dendera Zodiac, a bas-relief from the ceiling of a temple depicting a complete Egyptian star map. Not bad, not bad. This was all part of an archaeological space race to claim Egypt culturally, if not territorially, through scholarship, artifacts, popular enthusiasm, and good old-fashioned stealin' stuff. And in the game of excitement, boy oh boy did Britain have it. Writers, historians, artists, architects, and the general public alike devoured incoming material and even went to Egypt themselves to learn more and draw inspiration. Early in the process, John Martin's 1823 Seventh Plague of Egypt is a gorgeous architectural mega landscape of an Egyptian city, depicting the familiar Bible story with a power, terror, and vastness that had never been seen before. In the minds of the English populace, ancient Egypt was coming alive and becoming very, very real.
As Egyptomania gripped the English-speaking world, art was imitating life, and the first appearance of a proper reanimated mummy came to us in 1827, in a novel written by Jane C. Loudon, appropriately titled The Mummy, A Tale of the 22nd Century. This is a little bit false advertising, as while this story does contain a mummy, it is for the most part a sci-fi political thriller set in the distant year of 2126, where England is an absolute theocracy embroiled in a succession crisis after the assassination of the Queen. And also, there's a mummy. I'll spare you guys the full rundown because frankly the book is really long and contains soap opera levels of convolution, and if I'm being completely honest, I skipped over the middle third of it once it became clear that the mummy was not going to be a factor. But we don't really need to focus on that because we're here for mummies, and mummies we shall have. This mummy is none other than the builder of the Great Pyramids, Cheops, the Hellenized form of the name Khufu, which was at the time the more popular way to anglicize it. The mummy is perfectly preserved with all his organs intact, which is not at all how that works, but is going to be a common feature in future mummy narratives, and he's reanimated movie Frankenstein style using the futuristic galvanic power of electricity. And upon being reawakened, Cheops revives with all his physical and mental faculties intact and a healthy dose of powerful existential dread at being unceremoniously ripped from the sweet insensibility of the grave and thrust into a horrific industrialized future of fire and steel. However, despite being utterly terrifying, Cheops turns out to actually be a good dude who's trying to redeem himself for crimes of passion committed in life, namely the murder of his own father when he objected to Cheops committing the terrible crime of romantically pursuing his sister. The fact that this is framed as some unthinkable horror instead of of a thing that ancient Egyptian royalty did constantly and openly, is an interestingly telling bit of context for what was and wasn't common knowledge at the time. I'll consider it a mercy they hadn't yet figured out the family tree for the Ptolemaic Greek dynasties, because yeesh. It's also worth noting that while the Mummy's revival was theoretically done through science, the end of the book strongly implies that it was actually the will of the gods that gave him this second chance at redemption, introducing a theme in mummy media that the Egyptian gods still hold real and present power.
While the writers were revving their engines and speculating their fictions, Egyptomania continued to trundle along in the background, and nothing was more inspiring to the artists and writers of the day than a slate of brand new visual glimpses into what this ancient world actually looked like. The 1840s saw the publication of a 3-volume collection of written history and stunning prints of architecture and landscapes across Egypt called Sketches of Egypt and Nubia. It was a noted favorite of Queen Victoria, as well as a touchpoint to all its readers for a grounded historical understanding of Egypt. While this is logically the opposite of quasi-mythological ghost stories, all this was the essential foundation that interest in mummies was built on, and the critical flavor text that made these stories really hit.
As Egyptomania tightened its grip and the study of Egyptian history and hieroglyphs gained clarity, more mummies started popping up in literature. In 1840, the short story The Mummy's Foot was published in a French magazine about a young man who buys a preserved mummy foot to use as a paperweight, only to have an extremely vivid dream where the spirit of the princess whose mummified foot he now owns appears to try and reclaim her foot. When he returns it to her, she flies with him to Egypt to meet her father, but he's tragically told that their whirlwind relationship is doomed because the age gap is just way too problematic. I mean, she's 3,000 years older than him. Our hero wakes from the dream, but finds that the mummy's foot has been replaced with the princess's amulet, making him wonder if it was truly a dream after all. So this mummy story is less of a reanimated mummy situation and more a ghost story with extra steps. Instead of the mummy waking up and walloping anyone, she's just bound to her body in a spiritual sense due to some unfinished business. But this wasn't the only kind of mummy story going on in the 1840s. In 1845, everyone's favorite gothic horror icon, Edgar Allan Poe, got in on the fun with the short story Some Words with a Mummy, and we can expect nothing less from the master of the macabre to take the concept of a reawakened ancient corpse and use it for comedic social commentary. Okay. Some Words with a Mummy is about a perfectly preserved mummy, mummified again with all his organs intact, unwrapped, reawakened using the futuristic power of galvanic electricity again, and immediately being peeved off about the unceremonious treatment and profoundly unimpressed with the accomplishments of modern-day America. 90% of the story is a lengthy argument between the revived mummy and the crew of mummy aficionados about whose culture is superior, with the scales coming down heavily in favor of the extremely technologically advanced ancient Egyptians, who extended their already multi-century lifespans by perfecting the advanced scientific technique of embalming themselves alive into basically stasis. At the end of the story, our narrator resolves to have himself mummified for the next 200 years because his life isn't all that great, and he's curious to know who will be president in 2045. You and me both, buddy.
Meanwhile, back on the historical end of things, the decipherment of hieroglyphs was chugging along with the release of a preliminary translation of the Book of the Dead and an extensive Egyptian dictionary in 1867. But as the century progressed, Egyptomania also began to take physical shape in Britain. Architects were taking inspiration from Egypt as early as 1812 with the construction of the Egyptian Hall, but by the mid-century, exhibitions like the Egyptian Court at London's Crystal Palace in 1854 showcased Egyptian artifacts in lavishly reconstructed environments. It's one thing to see the Rosetta Stone in a deliberately plain museum setting, it's another thing to walk into a whole-ass temple. The Egyptian Court was part of the Great Exhibition of the Works of All Nations, as clear a sign as any that Egypt was firmly in Britain's cultural pantheon. Even when public buildings weren't trying to concoct entire Egyptian environments, they could still pull on Egyptian style just for funsies as part of the general architectural design language. Temple Mill Works is a simple flax mill, but when they built it in 1836, Egyptomania was already sweeping the island, and they made it look Egyptian because why not? It's fun, it's cool. And in an obvious pairing of design and gnarly edgelord vibes, many upper-class Victorians chose to bring the aesthetic to the grave, styling their headstones and mausoleums with Egyptian motifs. As a pervasive cultural fixation, Egyptomania had even the most minute applications, inspiring home furniture decorations as well as personal fashion. Gentlemen kept their cigars in boxes decorated to look like the Book of the Dead, which is a hilarious unintentional anti-smoking statement, and excavated jewelry inspired an abundance of Egyptian-styled regalia. Now, with so many Egyptophiles out there, you know that people would get gatekeepy about it. Short of a time machine, there's no way to ever prove this, but I can so vividly imagine some hoity-toity archaeology nerds seeing a woman wearing a scarab necklace and scoffing, "Oh, you're not even a real fan. Literally named 3 pharaohs." It's fundamentally unprovable, but come on. you know.
Mimicking the style and art of ancient Egypt in the context of non-ancient Britain was all well and good, but there was a pervasive and inescapable presence haunting the narrative, as it were, and that's the fact that ancient Egypt was full of ancient Egyptians, usually mummified ones. And it was pretty clear in the literature of the era that the fact that these striking edifices had people in them, people that those buildings and symbols and spellbooks were actually made for, was kind of coming across as more of a problem than a core feature of the entire concept of a tomb. In 1869, nice, we got another fun little jaunt into the world of fictional mummies with the short story Lost in a Pyramid, or The Mummy's Curse, one of the earliest examples of the concept of a horrifying curse befalling someone who desecrates the mummy's tomb. And this harrowing tale could only be written by the true grand dame of horror, Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. The story is short and sweet. A dude tells his fiancée the story of how he acquired this beautiful little golden box of mysterious seeds by getting lost in a tomb and burning a mummy for a handy-dandy smoke signal. So, on account of it having been burned to a crisp, there is no reanimated mummy in this one. Boo. But there is a curse. Hooray! Apparently, the mummy was a powerful sorceress who laid a terrible curse on anyone who disturbed her body, but he's sure it's fine. His fiancée saves one of the seeds and grows it in secret as a fun surprise for their wedding day, although she just can't seem to shake this mysterious illness that's been haunting her lately. And she wears the flower on their wedding day, which turns out to be a bad idea, shockingly, when he finds her that evening collapsed and catatonic, withered into a living corpse by the cursed flower. So while the story does contain a mummy's curse, it's a lot less overtly supernatural than most later incarnations of the format. Still, there's a vibe taking shape here, a slight inkling that maybe, just maybe, digging up and desecrating these mummies might be bad. And if that is bad, well, maybe there could even be consequences.
As we've seen, the Victorian fixation on Egypt had a lot of different venues and applications, from scholarship to literature, art, architecture, fashion, and more. But what we haven't yet addressed is what they did with mummies. See, the remains of the ancient dead had a distressingly non-zero number of uses in an Egyptomaniac society. Back in the Renaissance, Europeans, from scientists to royals, were known to eat mummified remains as a medicine, but the practice had sharply fallen in popularity in the 1700s. In the Victorian period, they were no more respectful of the dead, but at least less overtly cannibalistic about it, as mummies were used as firewood, ground up into pigment for a paint called mummy brown, and served as the main entertainment at parties. Our old pal Belzoni and his surgeon assistant first unwrapped a mummy as part of an exhibition in 1821, and in the decades after, his assistant saw absolutely no reason to stop. The man in question, one Thomas Pettigrew, further popularized the mummy unwrapping party, where he'd unwrap and autopsy the mummy for a spectacle at public events and private socials under the scalpel-thin guise of scientific inquiry. We've seen this pop up in some of the stories we've broken down, but it was beginning to fall out of style by the end of the century. Not out of any sense that this was a horribly disrespectful thing to do, but because eventually the spectators got bored when all the wrapping was gone and it was just a dead guy on the inside. It didn't even get up and do anything spooky. It's no wonder that the writers of the era started getting more creative with the possibilities of what an enterprising Englishman might do with the mummy given the right fictional tools.
And so we get another mummy story in 1892. This one from Arthur Conan Doyle, of all people. In lot number 249, we get possibly the first instance of a zombie-type shambling mummy. And not just that, this one is also reawakened by magic in the form of a papyrus scroll of spells. Our narrator is, in true Doyle form, a young heroic doctor bearing bemused witness to the shenanigans of an eccentric genius. Only unlike the ever-lovable Sherlock Holmes, this eccentric genius is a jerk using the power of exotic mysticism to revive a mummy and use it as a hitman to exact vengeance on his schoolyard rivals. This mummy is very strong, but seems basically mindless, with no evidence of thought or willpower of its own, and it ends the story pretty unceremoniously. Our hero gets sick of the shenanigans and threatens the eccentric genius at gunpoint until he destroys the mummy and burns the scroll. At this point in history, the noted fragility of mummies was pretty well tested, but in contrast to every real mummy that was unceremoniously cut apart and burned, this one maybe kind of deserved it. In 1903, another familiar name enters the ring. Bram Stoker, the Dracula man himself, wrote The Jewel of Seven Stars, a full-blown novel about a mummy. The book has two different endings, one original from 1903 and an updated one in 1912, but to be frank, I don't really like either of them, because this is another mummy story that just refuses to give us an actual revived mummy. However, it does lay down a lot of very interesting concepts that we start seeing more frequently later on. For one thing, this mummy does have a curse on her tomb, but she is not the one who put it there. In life, the mummy Queen Tara was a powerful sorceress who transgressed every rule, including gender roles, and took power that the priesthood wanted for themselves. After her death, the priests laid a curse on her tomb, decrying her as a blasphemer who defied the gods themselves, a trend we will be seeing a lot going forward. All of this feels like a moderately sensationalized version of the life and death of Queen Hatshepsut, whose tomb had been unearthed by Howard Carter earlier that very same year. However, in the wonderful world of fiction, Tara also made arrangements for her own revival in some future distant land, far to the north, where she can pursue freedom and true love, and she has a habit of magically entrancing or murdering people who are getting in her way of doing that. True love notwithstanding, this is all very sinister, and it gets more sinister when it becomes clear that Margaret, the demure and innocent love interest of our narrator, is Queen Tara's reincarnation, who is also being increasingly influenced and borderline possessed by the awakened consciousness of the dead queen. Tara's not really the uncontroversial antagonist of this story, and she's framed in a very sympathetic light at several points, while the protagonists work to complete her resurrection scheme in pursuit of science and knowledge. The concept that fucking with a mummy was maybe kind of disrespectful and invasive is actually directly addressed in this story, as Margaret strongly protests the unwrapping of Queen Tara in a room full of dudes who can't stop gawking at how hot and naked her extremely dead body is. However, in both endings of the book, the magical resurrection just straight up fails. Tara doesn't get revived in either version, and her body disintegrates both times. However, in the 1912 version, it is strongly indicated that she lives on in a new form as Margaret, her reincarnation. And through her marriage to narrator boy, she gets that true love she wanted all along, which is something, I guess. Is it too much to ask for a little girl boss mummy murder action? I don't think that's too much to ask. I support women's rights and women's wrongs. Is it too much to ask for a little girl boss mommy? Whoa. Whoa, boss. One important bit of context here is that Bram Stoker did his goddamn research. He was up to the minute on his Egyptology, and it shows. He doesn't just describe the artifacts accurately. He doesn't just describe the hieroglyphs correctly, he also goes into depth about the concept of the ancient Egyptian anatomy of the soul. This is huge, because up till now it has not come up at all in mummy media. But the ancient Egyptian afterlife was a complicated affair, and so was the concept of the soul and of death. The structure of it varies somewhat depending on where and when you are. After all, ancient Egypt was around for 3,000 years, and that is a long goddamn time. But in the general terms, as Stoker would have been taught, the ancient Egyptian concept of the soul was subdivided into several distinct parts. The Ka is the primary one, a vital life force or essence that animates the person and leaves the body after death. It's portrayed in hieroglyphs as upraised arms, and it needed to be maintained after death through offerings. The Ka is the most commonly name-dropped part of the soul in Jewel of Seven Stars, and Stoker equates it to an astral body that can separate itself from the mummy and move around, eavesdropping or even telekinetically manipulating stuff. It also seems to be possessing, or at least influencing, the female lead of the story, Margaret. But the Ka isn't the only key component of the soul. There's also the Ba, represented as a human-headed bird. The Ba is clearly somewhat separate from the person it belongs to. There's an actual ancient Egyptian story about this called The Dispute Between a Man and His Ba, where a guy has a full-blown argument with his own Ba because he's depressed and suicidal and longing for the eternal paradise that awaits him when he's dead, and his Ba calls him a dipshit and threatens to leave him if he doesn't shape up. Anyway, Stoker also name-drops a couple other key concepts. The Ib, or heart, which was crucial to preserve during mummification since it had to be weighed against a feather to judge the person's worth. The Ren, or name, which was extremely important because if the name of the deceased was expunged from record, they would die a second time. And he even mentions the shoot, or shadow, another slightly vague and confusing part of the person's unique identity. However, one interesting thing is missing from Stoker's rundown of the structure of the soul, namely the Akh, a spirit created through a ritual that reunited the Ba and the Ka into an entity that could travel freely between the worlds of the living and the dead. The bulk of Egyptian funerary literature was basically how to become an Akh after you bite the big one, so this is an interesting omission.
After the translation of hieroglyphs in the early 1800s, most of Egyptology was expanding on existing knowledge and capitalizing on popular enthusiasm, but it had been several decades since a truly transformative development in the field. With the start of the 1900s, we got it. First came the aforementioned discovery and excavation of Hatshepsut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The valley was an old standby for royal burials in the New Kingdom period because, unlike making an obvious mountain-sized advertisement to please Rob here, tombs cut into the walls of the valley were a little better hidden. Not hidden perfectly, as it didn't stop most of these tombs from being looted during antiquity, but their relative concealment at least kept the tombs untouched since the ancient period. And in the case of Hatshepsut, the 3,000-year-old thieves did the courtesy of leaving behind the mummified remains of two women, one of which was the femme pharaoh herself. It took another century to actually confirm that ID, but members of the public, like Mr. Stoker, were nonetheless certain to be following the news with immense interest. But this left Egyptomaniacs wanting, because they'd still yet to find a truly intact royal burial, undisturbed by ancient grave robbers or their Egyptomania-era successors. However, in 1922, everything changed when Howard Carter dug around the tomb of Ramses V and VI. Beneath that surrounding rubble and a layer of alluvium deposited by ancient flooding, they found something. a single stair step on the valley floor. Now, the sides of the valley had been thoroughly unearthed to the point that the previous excavation sponsor called the dig site exhausted, but no one had seriously dug into the valley floor. So clearing the staircase and working down, they came upon a tomb which prior archaeologists theorized about, but given the valley seemed to be all dug up, assumed couldn't actually exist. See, excavations in the decade prior had turned up scattered artifacts with the name Tutankhamun, an obscure pharaoh of medium consequence, notable mainly for undoing the monotheistic swerve of his father Akhenaten and not known for anything else. And wouldn't you know, that's exactly whose name Howard Carter found inscribed on the roughed up but still sealed door to the tomb. Breaching the seal with a tiny hole in the corner of the door, Carter and his sponsor Lord Carnarvon peered through with the flicker of a candle to find, quoting Carter, "As my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold." What lay inside in that antechamber he first peered into and beyond was a tomb untouched since antiquity, full of all manner of genuine artifacts from the New Kingdom period. Egyptomania had thus far feasted on ruins and scattered artifacts, but this was a royal treasure trove, and it came at the exact time the world needed. 1922 was, for you math fanatics out there, 4 brief years after the end of the First World War and 2 even shorter years after the Great Influenza epidemic. Everything sucked, and people wanted anything to be excited about. It was something unambiguously nice and fun and interesting and exciting that everyone could just enjoy after a decade of war and influenza and boundless suffering. King Tut, as his name came to be abbreviated, was a brief flash in Egyptian history during his life, reverting his kingdom's religion away from Atenist heresy and back to the polytheism we're familiar with, and then dying before turning 20. But his afterlife would prove among the most consequential in all of Egyptian history. If the 1800s were Egyptomania, the 1920s were Tutmania.
So I know I've been doing a lot of weird name dropping in this exploration of mummy literature, but we're nearly out of it, I promise. We've come up on the edges of the moving picture, and soon we'll be in the comfy territory of Hollywood horror. But before we do that, we've got one more short mummy story to check in on. Ghostwritten by legendary horror writer and frequent OSP punching bag H.P. Lovecraft, from the perspective and with the explicit consent of master escape artist Harry Houdini. This is not a crossover I was expecting, but I'm so glad it happened. In 1924, Imprisoned with the Pharaohs was published in Weird Tales, at the time presented as an autobiographical account of some crazy shit that went down when Houdini was on vacation in Egypt back in 1910. It was ghostwritten by H.P. Lovecraft a couple years pre-Call of Cthulhu, and if you know that going into it, it's real obvious. His fingerprints are all over this bad boy. The framing sequence of the story is that Houdini and his wife are vacationing in Cairo, and over the course of the tour, we get another reference to the Ka as the vital animating essence of the self, and a lot of genuine awe and wonder at the works of ancient Egypt very clearly coming through the narration. What is also very clear in the narration is a lot of disdain for everything in Egypt that isn't the picturesque parts of ancient Egypt. Houdini and co. are deeply unimpressed with modern Cairo and yearn for the quiet wonder of the ancient tombs which conveniently contain 0 living Egyptians. And this is kind of an undercurrent throughout this entire genre. This idea that ancient Egypt was cool, but modern Egypt is nothing but an inconvenience that makes life difficult for tourists and archaeologists that just want to go grave rob their grandparents in peace. Like, obviously, a genre this grounded in colonialist Egyptomania is gonna have some very deep roots in some very colonialist bullshit. But Lovecraft loves nothing more than saying the quiet part out loud, and he is very happy to make the overt villains of this piece the deceitful locals who follow their own insidious dark masters and stage a brawl so they can kidnap hapless American Harry Houdini, tie him up, and drop him down a really big hole. Given that Houdini's entire thing was being a master escape artist, you'd kinda think this wouldn't really be an issue. But this being a Lovecraft story, Houdini passes out from sheer existential terror no less than 3 times, which somewhat impedes his ability to escape the situation. He manages to stay conscious long enough to find himself in a truly inconceivably vast tomb underneath the Sphinx, housing a massive army of f***ed up and evil animated mummies, some fall into pieces, others mummified with animal heads in a horrifying parody of their ancient gods, abominations reanimated by their Ka, but not their soul. The distinction is not strictly clarified, but it's the thought that counts. This is when Lovecraft takes the mic back to explain that the army of mummies is paying tribute to some unseen horror that is all but stated to be the nightmarish elder death god that the Sphinx was carved to abstractly represent, meaning it loosely looks like a giant cat with a weird face, but of course its true form is incomprehensibly horrible. It's also heavily implied, although not really clarified that Houdini's local guide who arranged his abduction was secretly a reanimated mummy the whole time, since he strongly resembles the mummified King Kefren Houdini spots in the underground temple, which would make this an example of the reanimated mummy can pass for a creepy living human trope, or maybe it's just Lovecraft pulling a Lovecraft. It's horrifyingly ambiguous. Was this guy secretly a mummy all along, or is the narrator just incapable of distinguishing between two Egyptian men? I genuinely think this story is really fascinating, less because of how it contributes to mummy literature overall, and more because it's a really good look at how Lovecraft handles a horror story where he's not just 100% terrified of the thing he's writing about. Like, of course he is terrified about it, and he waxes poetic about how Egypt is a dark cradle of civilization that is ever the wellspring of horrors and marvels unspeakable, and of course his protagonist passes out from sheer terror just thinking about how spooky Egypt is, but at the same time he clearly has a lot of passion and wonder for the temples and the gods of ancient Egypt, and his terror of the unknown is being tempered by a genuine sense of awe. Even in the climax of the story, Houdini takes a little break from contemplating the horror of the big cat with weird face to admire the truly massive and flawless stonework around him. And, as a fun bonus, at no point does he ever suggest it was created by anyone other than the ancient Egyptians, a standard of decency that several modern storytellers fail to live up to. So he's still up to his old Lovecraftian shenanigans of everyone less white than me worships incomprehensible horrors that want to eat my skin, but at least he's not being condescending about it.
There may be few authors in history more susceptible to catastrophizing anything and everything into the terrors, but Lovecraft actually wasn't alone in this one. See, Carter and Lord Carnarvon did their preliminary peekaboo without notifying the right authorities, which annoyed the locals, and Carnarvon sold exclusive publication rights to the Times, which annoyed the other papers. But just the year after discovery, Lord Carnarvon died from an infection, and so there was an opportunity for drama. Back in the 1800s, with the initial wave of discovery, the finds came first and the stories came later, but by this point the general public had been primed with a century of mummy stories. So in revenge for losing out on publication rights, none other than the Daily Mail, that bastion of journalistic integrity, spun up a story that Carnarvon had been cursed, and people ate it the hell up. Sure, it was outlandish, and actual curse warnings were pretty sparse and mild in the historical record, but it deliberately leaned on popular perceptions. It's not like you can refute it. Have you, average 1920s viewer, ever gone into an intact Egyptian tomb and lived? I didn't think so. But what I think this highlights is not just that the find was spectacular, but that people had a century of study, art, and literature getting them ready for it. This wasn't just a tomb, it was the realization of Egyptomania's dream, and this time a lot more people were in on it. See, the wave of Tutmania also came at the best possible time for Egypt. The land of the Nile had spent the last several centuries as a province of other people's empires. After that brief Napoleonic interlude, it reverted to the Ottoman Empire, but following 1882, it was de facto a province of the British Empire. In 1922, Egypt gained formal independence, and all that Egyptomania in the air became an extremely powerful force for the new nation, asserting a fully Egyptian identity against both European colonizers and the Ottoman Empire alike, as if to say, it's not them and it's not them, it's Egypt. So Pharaonism, as it was called, became an ideological rally point for independent Egyptians, defining an identity not just in contrast to imperial overlords, but with a foundation 5,000 years old. That, admittedly, became a point of contention. The immediate consequence of Egyptian nationalism was a pyramid load of anti-Sudanese racism, but that core question of identity and ownership remained a thorny one. The Egyptomania craze was in many ways a race to claim kinship and ownership of ancient Egypt, and the claim was partly justified by the legacy of the Roman Empire, which Europeans were already comfortable drawing from, but the essential subtext is that Britain or France could do all that because the modern Egyptians weren't doing anything with all that history. It's no accident that the only Egyptian people who got attention in Victorian Egyptomania were the dead ones. The newly independent Kingdom of Egypt had a vested interest in associating ancient Egypt with modern Egypt, but other Egypt enthusiasts in Europe and America wanted those camps to stay firmly apart. Now that's a big topic to unpack, and there are a ton of thorny cultural biases tied up in that. The relationship between ancient and modern Egypt spills out to the entire space of cultural reception studies, but what matters for us here in Mummyland is that this question will continue to be litigated in mummy media over the following century. Once you realize this, you cannot unsee it. But back in the fun, funky, and significantly more casual world of people getting excited about history, the wealth of actual royal tomb treasures inspired a whole new wave of Egyptomania in art, jewelry, consumer goods, luxury items, music, dances, fashion, and most of the Art Deco movement. The iconic 1920s flapper dress is based on figures figures from Egyptian paintings, sometimes embroidered and decorated with Egyptian art to further sell the aesthetic. In the 1923 catalog for the Textile Color Card Association, colors got Egyptian names like papyrus, Saqqara, Luxor, Sphinx, and the supremely popular Eau de Nil, or Water of the Nile, a turquoise synonymous with Egypt throughout the 20s. Elsewhere in design and architecture, Art Deco channeled the royal opulence and monumental geometry of ancient Egypt. Ancient carvings on temple pylons and obelisks inspired the whole aesthetic of 1920s and 30s bas-relief sculpture, just with a modernist twist. And as simple as it is, Art Deco's enthusiasm for gold didn't come out of nowhere. That's got Egyptian roots as well. But now, part of the difficulty in discussing this is that the aesthetic was so influential, it's hard to mark where Tutmania stops and the rest of the 1920s in the rest of the world begin. However, that in itself is proof of how monumental the Tut discovery was at the time. I mean, holy hell, just look at that! Gorgeous! And it shows how familiar the world had become with Egypt after a century and a half of whirlwind discovery and feverish fascination. So it's no surprise that when the motion picture industry spun up in the early 1900s, it wouldn't be long before mummies made their debut on film.
The year is 1932. The Hays Code hasn't been invented yet, and Universal Pictures has a brand new horror movie on the market. The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, is about to rewire a lot of people's brains. Taken in the context of the stories we've already talked about, 1932's The Mummy is very much in line with the current shape of the Mummy story, but it ties the tropes together into a comprehensive format that cleans up very well. In fact, let's bust out our Mummy bingo cards for this one. I assume you've been making them. There will be a test later. To start, our eponymous mummy, Imhotep, is excavated from a tomb where he was mummified alive for committing some blasphemous crime, along with a sealed box bearing a hefty curse promising horrifying death for anyone who defies the will of Amun-Ra by opening it. When the box is obviously opened, it contains a papyrus scroll inscribed with a spell for reviving the dead, explicitly drawing on a little bit of real Egyptian mythology by crediting this as being the spell that Isis used to revive Osiris after his death and subsequent reassembly. Reciting a portion of the spell inadvertently reawakens the mummified Imhotep, who staggers out with the scroll and vanishes into the night. In his next appearance a decade later, the mummy has shed his bandages and donned a false identity that appears human, albeit somewhat unmoisturized. And he's here to arrange for the excavation and resurrection of his dead girlfriend, Princess Ankhesenamun. However, complicating matters, the princess's soul isn't just floating around waiting to be put back in a mummy. She's actually been reborn as the movie's female lead, Helen, the half-Egyptian daughter of a diplomat who is introduced at a fancy party gazing wistfully out at the pyramids while she laments how much she hates New Cairo and ancient Egypt is really where it's at. Since she's the reborn form of Ankhesenamun, when Imhotep tries to resurrect her, it puts Helen into a weird trance and calls her to him, and so his goal changes from reviving the mummy to reviving Ankhesenamun within Helen, and then mummifying her so they can be indestructible undead lovers together. Intruding on this scheme are our good old British archaeologist heroes, one of whom is naturally Helen's love interest. And even before Imhotep's identity and evil plan are revealed, they're not overly fond of him, because even though he directed them to the buried location of Ankhesenamun's tomb, he also demanded that the excavated artifacts be housed in the Museum of Cairo, rather than where they belong. You know, the British Museum. What a jerk, acting like he owns the place or something. Anyway, fortunately, while Imhotep has tremendous magical powers, they are in defiance of the Egyptian gods, and can be thwarted by a symbol of the goddess Isis, which our hero is encouraged to wear on a chain around his neck to save him from Imhotep's power of give people instant heart attacks whenever he wants. Yoicks. Surprisingly, when his scheme nears completion and Ankhesenamun reawakens in Helen's body, she is absolutely not on board with this whole let's be mummies together thing, and as a priestess of Isis, goddess of life, she finds the entire concept blasphemous and gross. She prays to the statue of Isis, and it responds by blasting a laser out of the ankh it's holding and vaporizing the scroll of Thoth, causing Imhotep to crumble to dust and the power of love to win the day, second only to the power of lasers. So they're playing the hits with this one, to the point where it almost feels like an unofficial adaptation of the Jewel of Seven Stars in a lot of key ways. We've got the mummy buried with a terrible curse placed on them by their enemies for blaspheming the gods, the mummy's revived through magic, specifically a magical artifact that was buried with it, and displays extremely potent magical powers in the form of hypnosis, telekinesis, and a few more Isises for spice. The love interest is the reincarnation of an ancient royal whose growing influence over her freaks out everybody while someone works to revive her ancient counterpart, and there's a few more sprinkled in for flavor from the other established tropes of the zeitgeist, like explicit proof of the power of ancient Egyptian gods. However, what I think is really interesting about this movie is how that Bram Stoker influence doesn't feel like it's just coming from the Jewel of Seven Stars. Parts of it feel just a little bit Dracula. The idea that an amulet of Isis can ward off Imhotep's influence is not an established bit of mummy lore at this point, point, but it's very much in line with the Dracula crew wearing little crucifixes to try and keep him away. Imhotep's hypnotic influence on Helen is also less Jewel of Seven Stars, where the hypnosis basically makes people catatonic, and more Dracula, where his influence makes his victims sleepwalk into vulnerable circumstances or remove their own protections and let him in. And of course, Imhotep's ultimate goal is to spread his curse of undeath to the heroine of the story so they can be together for eternity, which up until this point has not shown up in any mummy story, but is an enduring staple of the vampire genre, where its contagious element is a large part of the horror. So after this point in history, Egyptomania kind of slows its roll somewhat, thanks to the back-to-back wombo combo of the Great Depression and World War II. Hieroglyphs are, for the most part, cracked. New tombs are getting unearthed, sure, but mummy unwrapping parties are a thing of the past. And the idea that maybe Britain doesn't just automatically get to take whatever they want by virtue of being Britain is beginning to get a little bit more airplay in the world at large as widespread decolonization gets groovin'. But that means that the trope of the movie mummy is no longer being constantly reshaped by new discoveries and new ideas, and can instead start to settle into a more consistent arrangement. And so it does, starting in 1940 with The Mummy's Hand, the first of the classic Universal mummy movies. With a near-identical backstory to the 1932 Mummy, this bad boy is also mummified alive for a sacrilegious attempt at reviving his dead girlfriend, but instead of being revived through a magic scroll, he's been kept alive by a secret order of tomb guardians using a magic plant to sustain him as an undying protector for the princess's tomb. And, for the first time in a major movie production, we get a shambling zombie-type mummy, still in his bandages and for the most part nothing more than a mindless servant of the evil sorcerer pulling his strings. The Universal monsters all had a very formative effect on the monster designs that came after, and like Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster, this dude becomes the visual blueprint for the zombie-type mummies of future stories. Shambling, bandage-wrapped minions enslaved by some malevolent force or driving urge. And this specific mummy was popular. The Universal monster movies gave him 3 direct sequels and a 10 years later comedy encore where he got to deal with Abbott and Costello, the highest honor that can be bestowed on a fictional character. But this is where we start to see a divergence in mummy evolution. Because while the Universal-type bandaged-up mummies get locked into the trope space of basically just dry zombies, sometimes even portrayed as full-blown flesh-eating monsters like in 1981's Dawn of the Mummy, the sorcerer-type mummy established in the 1932 version becomes extremely iconic in its own right. Mummies that keep their bandages on are near-mindless monsters, but mummies that shed the wrappings and moisturize are intelligent, magically empowered, and typically motivated by some variant of Imhotep's iconic lost love story. And of course, a crucial step in the evolution of the movie Mummy came to us in 1999. The Mummy, 1999, is a loose remake of the 1932 version, but really all it retains from the original is the broad backstory of Imhotep, the name of his dead girlfriend, Anaxunamun, and the name Ardeth Bey, which in the 1932 version is just the pseudonym Imhotep uses to pass as an extremely non-suspicious normal guy. Now this movie is a goddamn delight, and none of you need me to tell you that, but when we break down the tropes involved, we notice some interesting changes. Imhotep was still mummified alive, but he's pointedly extremely not intact when they dig him up. And after he's revived by reading aloud from the Book of the Dead, identical to the use of the Scroll of Thoth in the original 1932 version, he has to replace his missing body parts by taking them from other people, a very gruesome twist on the genre that borrows a hefty chunk from zombie media by letting him be a half-rotted walking corpse until he can pull himself together. Imhotep is still a powerful sorcerer even when he's all juicy and gross, and once he's reclaimed all his key organs, he can easily pass for a normal living man. But a few key elements from the 1932 version are pointedly missing. Imhotep's power is still weak to the intervention of the Egyptian gods, but getting their help is no longer as simple as wearing a necklace. Imhotep has no interest in subterfuge or subtlety when he can just huck clouds of flesh-eating scarabs willy-nilly, and his lost love Anaxunamun has not been conveniently reincarnated as the female lead. While he briefly mistakes Evelyn for her, it's strongly implied that this is because the dude whose eyeballs he just stole needed really strong glasses. Now admittedly in the sequel, The Mummy Returns, Anaxunamun's reincarnation does show up, and also it turns out Evie is the reincarnation of a different Egyptian princess, and then they have an ancient Egyptian karate fight about it, but that's fine. You know what? It's fine. This movie also features some more classic zombie-type mummies serving as Imhotep's minions during the final act of the movie. But the most interesting change between the 1999 Mummy movie and its precursors is the role of Ardeth Bey and the Magi. Because, frankly, if you were watching an early Mummy movie and you wanted to know who the bad guy was, all you had to do was look for the person trying the hardest to stop our heroic archaeologist-leading men from ransacking the local tombs. Imhotep in 1932 forces the Brits to keep the treasure of Ankh-Senamun in the Museum of Cairo, but this is is all a scheme to give him access to her mummy so he can revive her. The line of tomb guardians in the 1940 movie are weaponizing a mummy to guard the princess's tomb, and our heroes celebrate their hard-earned victory at the end of that movie by making absolute bank cashing in on all the gold and jewels they plundered after shooting the main bad guy and setting the mummy on fire. Ooh, I haven't had a chance to do this one in a while. Truly a victory for the forces of justice. In the trope space of the early Mummy movie, nothing was more narratively sinister than trying to keep the mummy in its grave. But in 1999, possibly reflecting a general cultural shift towards questioning whether treasures belong in a museum or belong with the people whose treasures they are, the framing of the tomb guardian trope goes from being evil and obstructionist to archaic and obstructionist, but ultimately not wrong. The Magi are intimidating and initially antagonistic only because they do not want the living plague murder mummy roaming free, and once he wakes up anyhow, the Magi go full enemy of my enemy and team up with our heroic problem causers to clean up the big mess. Ardeth Bay. More like Ardeth Bay. The trope of the modern mummy contains an interesting reflection of how we define monstrosity. Because like we've discussed, the context of the mummy contains a lot of quiet parts. Unlike the Wolfman or Dracula or Frankenstein's monster, the mummy is a dead person. A person who's supposed to be at rest, dragged back to life by the intervention of science or magic or something in between. And the personhood of the mummy comes through in a lot of those early stories. Mummies haunt the narrative of Egyptomania because they are an inescapable reminder that Egyptomania was built on tomb robbing. Yeah, the building is cool, but it wasn't built for you. There's gonna be a guy in there. And so the mummy takes center stage early, and the story that takes shape around them paints the heroes that face the mummy as, in some way, trespassers. The part that's shifted the most over the centuries is whether or not that trespassing is good, actually. The post-1940 universal image of the shambling mummy was more of an unthinking obstacle to our hero's riches acquisition than it was a person. But the personhood of the mummy cannot be forgotten. The simple fact of how well preserved they are means anyone confronting a mummy has to stare humanity in the face. Some of the oldest Egyptomania mummy stories show overt sympathy for the mummy, and while the bandaged zombie-type mummy is still a popular image for generic horror monsters and contains some comforting distance and inhumanity that makes it easy to write off as an interchangeable minion monster, when it comes to characterization, modern stories dramatically favor the Karloff-type mummy, where the humanity is on full display. Sometimes they even play this like a twist. Surprise! That ancient and unknowable monster is a person with thoughts and feelings and motivations and stuff. And they might have turbo sorcerer's wizard powers and they might still be a bad guy, but they're a bad guy. They're a person. And that's inescapable. We can't pretend the mummy doesn't exist in the full context of Egyptomania and archaeology and the ethics or lack thereof. Who can really claim ownership of the vast buried riches when the dude whose name is on the cartouche is buried 10 feet away? Mummy media cannot ignore the dead guy in the room. We dig up ancient history, and we see ourselves.
Whew, this one was a doozy, huh?
Yeah, no kidding.
But I think you really wrapped it up nicely.
I'm putting a curse on your half of the channel.
Listen, I'm just happy I got out of the Amontillado cellar.
How can you see into my eyes like open doors, leading you down into my core, where I've become so numb, without a soul tonight. My spirit sleeping somewhere cold until you find it there and lead it back home. Wake me up inside. I can't wake up. Wake me up inside. Save me. Call my name and save me from the dark. Wake me up. Bend my blood to run before I come onside. Save me from the nothing I've become. Bring me to life. There's nothing inside. Bring me to life. All of this time I can't believe I couldn't see. Kept in the dark, but you were never far from me. I've been sleeping 1,000 years, it seems. Got to open my eyes to everything. I'm wrong without a voice, without a soul. Don't let me die here. There must be something more. Bring me to life. I can't wake up. Wake me up inside.